Welcome, everyone, to Earth in Crisis, Series 2. My name is Aurelio Muraca. I am the Technology Program Coordinator here at the Danbury Library. On behalf of the Friends of the Danbury Library, I welcome you to our next series hosted by Dr. Mitch Wagener on our changing climate and changing world. Tonight's lecture will be called Agriculture in a Warming World. So without further ado, Mitch, you have the con.
Okay. All right. So I always start my classes with this. Come on. There we go. My talks with this picture. You should see the science building. If you don't, let me know and I'll hit it with a hammer or something. But this is our science building on the Midtown campus. Pardon me. We have a split campus, and as most of you probably know, some of you may be WestCon alums. Well, anyway, this is I'm always encouraging young people to consider WestCon. So I always put in a plug for it, and that's why I start with this particular slide. Now, let's see. There we go. Now, let me start this by saying that I am not specifically a farmer. I am a very amateur gardener, but what I am is an ecologist. And one of the ways which agriculture can be best explained in terms of climate change is by considering agroecosystems as ecosystems, meaning the environment of a farm, a garden. The environment of a small garden is, at least on the small scale, changed relative to what it would be if you just let it alone and let nature take its course. Okay. Whenever people clear land, as we must if we want to eat for agricultural purposes, we are changing things. And some of those changes will be affected by climate change, different than natural ecosystems. Some of them will change and feed back into climate change and make it stronger or weaker on the local level. Now, that's the thing about climate change. That's the thing about the Earth systems. And that's one of the reasons why, to me, it's a sad thing that students aren't taking Earth science as often as they did back at a few years ago, because it is the basis for a lot of what I'm going to talk about. Okay, which is okay with me because I like talking about Earth science. All right, so here's a lovely picture of the Earth. It is not one of the Apollo 8 photos that I often will start these talks with. It's a mosaic made up of pictures taken from satellites that have been stitched together to make a very nice mosaic, a composite photo, and it shows us specific things. If you go look in the Weather Channel or other media sites like that, you're going to see all sorts of wonderful pictures like this. Some of them are animation, some of them are photos, and they give you the impression of the Earth as a single system, or a portion of the Earth as a single system. As an ecologist, that's my particular bias, as it were, that ecology is the study of a portion of the Earth clearly defined as a system with feedback systems and turning points and all these nonlinear processes, which I'll mention a few of them today. Okay, so what you're getting then is agriculture as seen from an ecologist. I presented this basic same talk to what am I trying to say? some farming people, some folks that are organic farmers and stuff, and they have not raised any objections, so I don't think it's much of a problem. All right. Okay, trying to forward my slide. There we go. I'll have to do it manually. Okay, as I mentioned, ecologists are system thinkers. We see the world as systems, and systems are basically made up of smaller systems all working together to provide the function of the larger system. And ecology is a nested set of these systems from relatively small size, in the case of one organism as they interact with the universe, to populations of animals or plants or microbes of the same species that are all interacting among themselves, to communities, various organisms that live in a given area and interact, to ecosystems where we look at the interactions between the living things and the non-living things, all the way up to the biosphere. And biosphere is the scale at which climate change occurs, the effects of climate change occur, and that is in fact that area on, above, or below the Earth's surface where life can exist. All right. And so each one of these levels of organization is a system. And it's a way I like to look at things, and it's the way that ecologists look at things if they're going up or going down in terms of scale. Now, ecosystems, and this applies to a forest as well as an agricultural area, a farm, ecosystems are a more or less bounded area, an area that where you have borders and you can tell what's in and what's not in the ecosystem. And looking at inputs to the system, looking at outputs to the system in terms of nutrients and oxygen and CO2 and all that sort of stuff. And then looking at the cycling of things within the system. All right. I personally am a soil ecologist. I did my research in the taiga forest in Alaska, and I got my doctorate from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Now, there are different kinds of ecosystems that pop up around the world, and they are all very distinctive in the way they look, all the way from the savannas of East Africa with all the wildebeest and the elephants and whatnot, to the tropical rainforest, to the grasslands of middle North America, to the boreal forest, to the tundra. And all these environments are different in the kinds of organisms that are found, in the rate at which nutrients are cycled, and in the kind of organisms you can expect to find there. And they're all predictable in terms of a combination of moisture, precipitation here, and air temperature. If you plot air temperature, that's a yearly average air temperature in degrees Celsius, and precipitation centimeters per year, and you gave me two numbers, I could tell you what biome is likely to be there. Okay, it's pretty well studied. We are here in the temperate deciduous forest, meaning trees lose our leaves about this time of year. All right, and there are other differences between these biomes, including the types of soil that are found there, the amount of biomass, the mass of the living organisms, and the productivity, how fast they grow, and all that sort of stuff. So if you're an ecology nerd like me, you can go in and learn a lot about what the difference between a temperate grassland and a temperate deciduous forest are. Now, as the world warms, we are going to, at any given spot, move from relatively cooler to relatively warmer on the y-axis. We may, in fact, get wetter. We might get drier at any place, and so an environment which is grassland today may be temperate forest in a generation, or some other change, depending on which way the combination of factors move. Now, time is another important thing that it's good to have a basic understanding of here. Let me just briefly mention a couple of highlights in the Earth's history. One is the Earth 4 and 4.7 billion years ago would be. Animals didn't show up until half a billion years ago. First humans didn't show up until 2 million years ago. The anatomically modern humans, the ones that are the most like us, show up of 250,000 years ago. The last ice age ended 16,000 years ago. And then here's the point I want to get down to. Agriculture only shows up, meaning humans invented it a mere 10,000 years ago or so. Okay. So if you look at the entire human history from the beginning of Homo erectus 2 million years ago, you know, almost all of human history, there was no agriculture, right? And and for anatomically modern humans, 90% of our history did not have agriculture. We were chasing wildebeest around in sharp sticks or whatever animal we chose to hunt. And then I throw that last line in for my students because, you know, beetles, no one has yet said who are the beetles, but nonetheless, it's not a group that's necessarily in their search pattern. All right. Now, as the world warms, there's a variety of changes that we have measured as happening. They are not expectations, they are what we have lived and we have measured over the course of 40 years or so. Okay. And so the scale on the x-axis for years is about 1980 to 2020. Okay, and you can use that scale for all the rest of the little graphs. And there are a variety of things that have occurred, which if you would ask certain scientists in 1980, they would have probably expected most of them, and a few of them they wouldn't. And that includes the increase in carbon dioxide. That will have a direct influence on agriculture, as we'll talk about. Methane, nitrous oxide, which is a direct impact. I mean, it is a direct effect of agriculture. Most of the extra nitrous oxide, which is laughing gas, but it's not a laughing matter. I've been practicing that joke all day, just anyway. Is something that is characteristically produced by agriculture, and it's a very strong greenhouse gas too. And you can see surface temperature has gone up, and all these other things that are not directly related to what we're talking about today, like ice masses decreasing and so on. Ocean acidity is going down, meaning that the pH is going down, which means that CO2 is being dissolved into the oceans and so on. And so all these things are related to climate change, and all of them are measured and shown to be consistent with it. If you look at the temperatures as we have been able to either estimate them in the past or measure them directly in the present, we got satellites popping around all the time that can collect infinite amounts of data for us, and so that our measurements are quite precise. When we're estimating what the temperature of the world was in 1860, we are less precise because no satellites. We had to put it all together from the logs of sailing ship captains and people who happen to like measuring temperature and writing it down, like Thomas Jefferson and so on. But nonetheless, you see the trend is that temperature goes up and down year to year. It's not the same it's not the same, but it is also trending in a clear way. And the reason why one year is not the same as the next, or is not linearly changing in a straight line, is because of these four factors. Okay. One is that weather is chaotic. We have air is a fluid, and when air moves through other air, it doesn't move in a straight line. It kind of gets diverted, and and so water moves that way, air moves that way as well. And that means that in the mathematical sense, the movement of weather is chaotic. Okay. Some processes, such as El Nino, La Nina, oscillate. One thing that we've learned more and more about that is very important is that some processes like ENSO, that El Nino Southern Oscillation, flips from one state to another state in not exactly predictable ways. We don't know when they're going to do it, but we can predict roughly what the effects are going to be. Okay, we're in a La Nina now, but it's probably working its way toward the end. Solar intensity is not constant, and volcanoes erupt whenever volcanoes erupt, and they will have a short-term effect. And so put it all together, and the last 7 years are the 7 warmest years in recorded history. That's what this graph is telling us. 2016 and 2020 being the warmest. And which one is warmer than the other depends on whether you're looking at American or British data. So, and they're very close. And 2021 is really, really hot in some places and not quite as hot in others, and downright cooler than the baseline in others. Well, notice that the Pacific to the west of Ecuador and Peru is blue. It indicates that it is cool, which is characteristic of a La Nina event. Other places like northeastern North America and other places that are red are hot. I'll be interested to see what this year's 2020 map will look like. Now, this is what we might expect in 2023. What we might expect in 2023 is temperature. These are kind of monthly guesstimates of what might be based on what we have seen recently and how we understand how all this works. And it looks like California is going to stay hot. The Gulf Coast is going to stay hot. The Atlantic seaboard is going to stay hot. So there you go. Now, in weather, as associated with weather, which is a short-term phenomenon, and climate, which is a long-term phenomenon, there are a number of weather measurements and calculations that climatologists talk about that directly relate to agriculture. And I'll just whip through these quickly. Winter minimum, how cold the coldest winter is. That's what the USDA uses to make their growth maps, which we're going to see in a minute. Summer maximum heat. Some plants are just not as tolerant to heat as others. How much the nights cool off. One thing we see in a warming world with greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is the nights don't cool off as much at night as they did when we were kids, if you can remember back that far. Heat islands are created whenever you have a whole bunch of cement that heats up during the day and continues to radiate all night. And they are, if there's agriculture near those areas, they're going to be affected. Now, some plants and some insects too have lifespans that are timed by what are called heat sums. They're degree days. They're a collection of warmth that adds one to the next until they reach a threshold, and then something happens. The bloom, they flower, or an insect pupates, or whatever. Okay, not all plants and animals do this, but some do, and some agriculture crops do as well. And then some are also key to frost-free days. How many days do you have between the last frost in the spring and the first frost in the fall? So you can imagine tomatoes and peppers and eggplant and all the tender crops that you might want to grow in your garden, or farmers might want to grow. are going to be affected by how long the season they have. Okay. Humidity, precipitation, wind velocity and direction, storm frequency, and fire frequency are all things that are going to affect agriculture, directly or indirectly. Now, where does all this heat go? Lucky for us, most of the heat gets sucked up by the oceans. The oceans have a particular specific heat, which you may have learned in chemistry class way back when. Specific heat where they can carry more heat than air, and they can change temperatures more slowly than air does. So a lot of this heat that is being trapped by greenhouse gases is going into the oceans, and it is buffering our environment today. But the bad side of that is if we have a cooling down at some point, then that cooling will be lessened by the fact that you've got all this heat nearby in the ocean. All right. Now, for those of you who are gardeners, or you're, going to see if you can grow figs in your yard this year, which is something I thought about doing. I have one in a pot, but I haven't had the guts to actually plant it in the ground yet. The Department of Agriculture prepares these plant hardiness maps that they update ever so often. Here is the one that came out in 1990 on the left, and then one that came out in 2012 on the right. And I looked and I can't find one more recent than that. Perhaps there is one out, I just didn't find it. But nonetheless, I can make the point I need to make from here. And this plant hardiness zone category is based on what the average expected minimum is in the winter, how cold it gets. So when I lived in Fairbanks, Alaska, the expected minimum temperature in the winter was probably -45. Okay, so you can't grow figs in the ground in Connecticut, nor many other kind of fruit trees or anything like that. There's choke cherries and stuff that will grow up there, but that's about it. Well, anyway, we are in where we live here in Fairfield County, kind of on the edge between a couple of these plant hardiness zones. And so back in 1990, which is actually before I lived in Connecticut, Danbury was firmly in zone 6A, which expects a minimum temperature in the winter of -5 to -10 Fahrenheit. No, that's Celsius. No, it's Fahrenheit. They have both graphs there, or both scales there. And since that time, in 2012, they adjusted the maps, and Danbury is now on the boundary between 6A and 6B. And figs, just as a reference, can be grown in a sheltered location in 6B. So you can grow them on Long Island, certainly, and maybe on the Gold Coast, but very far inland, and you're a little shaky there. And crepe myrtle, that would be another plant that might grow here at some point in the future. So anyway, these maps are documenting climate change because they're documenting where the low temperatures are. They're going to affect which crops, tender crops, are able to live outdoors all winter. Okay, the point I was trying to make. Well, I made this graph, 2006, as you can see, and this was just the mean temperature in Celsius for Connecticut. And it was the blue lines are the year-to-year variation, and the red line is the 5-year running average, meaning the average of 2.5 years prior, 2.5 years later. Give you an idea of what the trend is. So you can see that it was up and down a lot, but warming. I have not updated this graph. This is the growing season. This is the tomato growing season. This is the number of days between the last frost in the spring and the first in the winter. And you can see that 1965 was a very short growing season, just from looking at this data. And it goes up and down a fair bit, but the overall trend is towards a couple, like 2.5 weeks longer growing season now than it was in 1947, something like that. All right. I think we already talked about that. Yeah, skip that too. All right. So what's driving the warming? As you all know, there are certain gases that humans have been inclined, not on purpose, but have been released as a waste product of human civilization, that when they accumulate in the atmosphere and increase quantity in the atmosphere will trap heat. Okay, CO2 is the one that everyone talks about because it's associated with fossil fuels, which we began to burn in large amounts starting in the early 1800s. Now, two things to note from this little zigzag line. This is what's called the Keeling curve, invented or first shown this in this form by a gentleman who invented the machine that will actually measure CO2, is this seasonal effect. So in the summer of the northern hemisphere, it gets warm. I mean, there is the trees are blooming, they're growing, they're sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, and the amount of CO2 goes down. In the southern hemisphere at the same time, it's the winter, but there isn't as many trees because there's not as much land mass. All right. And so we have a yearly cycle of the earth breathing in, the earth breathing out, on top of a very clear trend. In fact, as of yesterday, there's a website, by the way, where you can look this up. The average CO2 concentration is 414.6 parts per million. And the year before on the same date was 413, and pre-industrial was 280. So that's where we stand right now. Now, where does all this CO2 come from and where does it all go? And this relates to agriculture. This graph, and I'm going to magnify the part that's the most important. On the left, show forms or sources from which CO2 is produced. Electricity production is in orange, food, agriculture, land use, industry, transportation, buildings, and miscellaneous, okay? Those numbers, add them all up, you got 100. And then on the right is where the CO2 goes. Well, 59% of the CO2, which is being added to the atmosphere, is staying there. Okay. 24% is going into the terrestrial environment, growth of plants and whatnot. And 17% is going into the ocean. So if we look at the input, we can see that food, that would include food waste and food production, agriculture, which is include not only CO2, but methane and nitrous, and land use changes account for about 24% of the added CO2 into the atmosphere. So agriculture has a role in the increase in the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And it's a very complicated position it has. And the effects of all this stuff on agricultural productivity is very complicated. I'm not going to go through all the spaghetti. These are called spaghetti diagrams with all the lines. But there are a lot of things, including the warming of the environment, which are going to affect agricultural productivity. Also include, the global warming will affect human health, the growth of weeds, the conversion of land from one thing to another. And if it becomes a desert, it's not something particularly useful for humans. The decline in fresh water available for irrigation, the altered rain patterns, the biodiversity, the amount of ozone in the atmosphere, which will then influence the amount of ultraviolet radiation, which can shine on your crops and so on, and so on. And so climate change is adding energy to the system, which is kind of poking on agricultural productivity from all directions. And if you look at a smaller scale, farms in general, from the biggest to the smallest, it's just a matter of how big the arrows will be. will have a decrease of CO2 in the form of growing plants, which pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere, and a increase in CO2 from tractors burning diesel, from the farmhouse heat, from other things. It has an increase in methane from many farm animals. Cows are famous for this. The Western breed of cows produce more methane than the Eastern breeds, the Brahma, the Asian breeds. Apparently, cows are domesticated at 2 different times. And so they have different lineages and different wild ancestors and stuff like that. And plus, Western cattle have been bred for a particular type of producing cattle for beef, finishing off in stockyards and all that sort of stuff, which maximizes the amount of density of cattle in one place and producing methane out of both ends as they do. Okay. Eastern cattle are used for a variety of other purposes. They're not held in such large amounts. They're eaten less often and so on. So there's also this stuff called nitrous oxide, N2O, which is produced from animal manure. It's produced by crops. It's produced by cultivation. And it is a product of agriculture, to not exclusively, to a large extent, however, and it's a strong greenhouse gas. So nitrous, that's also laughing gas, as I mentioned. Now, there are specific effects of carbon dioxide. If you can run an experiment, and research has been done, where you grow soybeans in different sets of conditions, and including different amounts of water, different amounts of temperature, and different amounts of CO2. And then you can measure how much starch there is and protein in those plants with all these different environmental variations. Okay, and CO2 has the following effect. It increases the rate of photosynthesis. Okay, CO2 is taken in and combined with water and through a highly complicated set of one enzyme after the other in this cyclical pathway called the Kelvin-Benson cycle, and out pops glucose. Okay, that's basically what happens. All right, so the more CO2, the faster the little whirligig engine can run that produces glucose, which then gets combined together for starch and for other sugars and stuff. Okay, now there's 2 basic types of plants. One are adapted to environments which are cooler but have more water availability, and those are the C3 plants. Wheat is an example. Maize is a C4 plant that was developed in an environment which were hotter, but water may not be as available. Okay, so C3, cooler, more water; C4, warmer, less water. Right. And as such, they behave different too when you give them more CO2. Okay. Generally speaking, what you get is you get more starch. When you pump more CO2 in provided to the plants, you get more starch, but you get less protein. So it's of lower quality as animal silage or as human food. Okay, and the mechanism for how this works is kind of cool if you had a biology class at some point. Plants have these little pores that they can open up and close down to release gases. They have to be able to release, oxygen and take in CO2, and sometimes the reverse. And they need to be able to release water in order to, that's their version of sweating, to cool themselves down. And so if you increase the amount of CO2, what you get is you have fewer of these little openings. They're called stomata, means little mouths. And if the plants have fewer stomata, they have lesser ability to release water to the atmosphere. which means that they use less water, but they also have a harder time cooling themselves down because they can't sweat as much. Okay. Now, crops in general we see this. We see that CO2 increases, increase leads to decreased concentrations of micronutrients. Things like, selenium and these little metals and stuff that iron and things like that crops will take in that are part of the package of nutrients that for the animals that eat them, including us. So higher CO2 leads to reduced plant uptake of nitrogen, meaning that in a world that has more CO2, the crops in general will have less protein in them. They'll be a lower quality as food. And this will affect primarily poorer countries where other meat and other things that are alternate sources of protein are less available. So that the reduction of protein in crops will hit the poor nations harder. That's what I'm trying to say. Now, in rice specifically, rice is one plant that seems to be able to survive and grow well in a warmer climate. However, it's going to be more starch, it's going to be less protein, just like the others. Okay. So it'll also have less of iron and zinc and some other things like that. It's the same pattern. You give a plant more CO2 and they'll grow and produce more of one thing, but less of another. Now, you can't talk about agriculture without talking about insects. Plants and insects evolved together. The reason we have so many different kinds of insects in the world is because we have so many different kinds of flowering plants and vice versa. They evolved in response to each other. Okay. And not all insects, but many insects eat plants. Many eat other insects. They may eat fungi. They may eat other things. They may eat us certain times. But there are a lot of different kinds of insects. There's a lot of insects, and there's a lot of them that are, for better or for worse, involved in agriculture crops. They are the most diverse group of organisms on Earth. Okay, this diagram basically draws different kinds of plants and animals in size proportion to the number of species we know that they consist of. Okay, so you got this big beetle here, which is the biggest one of the crowd, and a little tiny elephant there representing the mammals. Yeah. And so, the second largest group is among the animals are the arachnids, mites and spiders and scorpions and whatnot. Insects are the success story. They are the first group of animals to ever evolve flight, which opened up the world to them. They're amazing creatures. I have taught in the past entomology as a summer class, and that's a lot of fun. All right, so insects are involved in plants in general, farm crops in specific, in terms of pollination. You've got tons of plants out there that rely on insects to carry the pollen from one flower to the other to fertilize it. You take away the insects, take away the pollinators, and the plants die because they have no way of reproducing. Not all plants do that. Okay. For instance, this time of year we get goldenrod, which people often associate with their seasonal allergies. Well, it's not the goldenrod that's doing it. The goldenrod has sticky pollen that will not blow around in the wind. What you're sniffing and what I'm sniffing and causing me suffering is the ragweed that is blooming at the same time, but you don't see it because it doesn't have showy flowers. It doesn't rely on insects. It's wind pollinated, which means they produce a lot of pollen, which gets in your eyes and gets in your nose and so on. So goldenrod has a bad rap. Okay, it's the ragweed that's our annual enemy this time of year. Okay, so insects pollinate. If they are wild insects and wild crops, then they are going to be at the mercy of those factors in the environment which determine when the plant flowers and when the insects can reach those flowers. So climate change can change that. We'll talk about that in a minute. Insects in some areas are being eliminated, not all of them, but the diversity is going down precipitously. Now, how many of us are old geezers like me that remember driving around the summertime and your car windshield will be covered with squash bugs? Now, think about how many you get now. Not many. The bugs, there just aren't as many of them flying around, as judged from your car sampling them with their windshield. The diversity is decreased, and the diversity means the different kinds, and some of those that are being decreased are going to be those insects that are required as pollinators. Some plants will accept a variety of different kinds of insects for pollination, like goldenrod. Some of them only require one specific thing, and if they lose that one specific thing, then they cannot survive. Likewise, some insects require one specific plant. Others can visit lots of different things, and so the generalists are the ones that are going to survive. The specialists are going to have a harder time. And then ever so often you get an insect population that'll just have a big outburst, and you got gazillions of them. Locusts, swarms of locusts, as an example of that, which are not as big a deal here as they are in other places. Okay, now as the weather warms, the timing and the environmental cues that are triggering certain behaviors and certain life events in plants and insects can change. Okay, so here's a hypothetical insect that pupates along the red curve. Okay, and then we have a plant which is flower at the same time. And this is not meant to show that the pupa of that insect eats the wheat, but that the environment can be changed by a change in temperature, spring coming earlier, for instance. If you have a cold winter, the wheat will be affected more, and the pupae insect coming out of the pupae will be delayed some, or the wheat will be less affected. If you have a warmer winter, the wheat flowering will move up and the insect emergence will move down. So the point here is you can have a colder year and a warmer year, which normally would happen even before climate change. And some years you're going to have these things happening at the same times, and some years you wouldn't. Now, as we're adding heat to the system, we're shifting it in a particular way, which we don't really know what all the results are going to be in the end. For instance, here's a plant called the subalpine larkspur, which blooms about the same time that Western bumblebees are around to pollinate it. Okay, and they evolved, both species, the bumblebees and the larkspurs evolved to be, to be active and doing their thing where they interact at the same time. Okay, so flower needs bees, bees need flowers. They're at the same place at the same time with the same thing on their mind, and everything's good. That's historically, but with climate change, warming, you have a movement of the flowers blooming earlier, and the bees really not changing that much in terms of their life history. And so for a good lot of the time when the larkspurs are blooming, there aren't any bees around to pollinate them. And a lot of the time when the bees are out, the larkspur blossoms are not there for them to eat, and they may be able to adjust to different plants, but maybe not. Bees, bumblebees tend to be fairly general, but still. Okay, the point here is we have what's called a trophic mismatch, meaning you have a change where previously animals are relied on each other, were active at the same time, and suddenly their availability is spread out, so they're just not interacting very much. And another thing that can happen is that insects are cold-blooded, meaning that if you warm them up modestly, their life speeds up. And if you provide more months of warmth, then you may get another generation of insects that year. Okay, so as the climate warms, some insects, I think this is a wood-boring beetle just from the look of it, might be able to go from 2 generations a year to 3, which is probably, if it's a pest species like a wood-boring beetle, that's not a good thing. Another effect of increasing warmth. Now, associated with, but not directly part of climate change, is the kind of insecticides that we use to protect our crops so that more is there for people to eat and less is available for insects to eat. And we make these chemicals based on chemicals that plants evolved to do the same thing. Okay, nicotine. There's a whole raft of chemicals called, whole raft of chemicals that are all related, that like caffeine and opium and mescaline, that are all chemically similar, that were evolved by the plants as a way of deterring insects from eating them. Okay, they're also physiologically active on us. And so we have used a lot of these for a lot of things. Nicotine is a stimulant, I think. I don't know, I never smoked, but anybody who's smoked knows the effect that nicotine has on you. And it was evolved by a certain group of plants, including tobacco, but not exclusively, in order to deter insects. Okay? And we found all sorts of uses for these. I mean, quinine is one of those. The first chemical that we could use to cure malaria. And so, I mean, some of this stuff has been very useful to us. But there are other things we, find entertaining or useful in some ways, like caffeine. Well, the chemical industry has come up with different versions of these, which they've constructed based on the basic model, nicotine, which are particularly effective on one insect or another. They're called neonicotinoids. Okay, they are new chemicals basically built from the structure that the plants evolved, which we have used, and they're quite good at killing insects, including some we don't want to get killed. Okay. Neonicotinoids are probably one of the insects that are, one of the pesticides that are reducing the number of honeybees. Now, people have noted that honeybees aren't as common anymore, but you also have to realize that honeybees are introduced, they're not natives here. And so you get the most honeybees when you've growing, you're keeping, you have someone who's keeping bees for honey production. Okay, there's other bees. I mean, I seem to be getting plenty of bumblebees bopping around my passion flower vines I have in the backyard. Anyway, so chemists do the same thing. They get all these chemicals which plants have produced and converted. They convert them in some way which makes them particularly more useful and so on. And these things have non-target species will come along and they'll harm things in addition to those plants, those insects you want to protect. And people will go around and around trying to pronounce these names. Imidacloroprid or clothianidine or things like that. And there was recently a meme on Facebook that appropriate when you try to pronounce the name of your prescriptions but accidentally summon Satan instead. Well, I think the same thing. It's the same problem you have trying to pronounce insecticide names. All right, well, there's a joke for you. Now, as I mentioned, in some parts of the world, Africa, for instance, and this happened in my wife's country, Uganda, just a couple of years ago, they had a set of conditions, which is usually a year of really good food availability for these grasshoppers, locusts and grasshoppers. Or in locusts, there are two things that we commonly call locusts. One's really a cicada. We call them locusts. I don't know why, but locusts in most of the world are grasshoppers, one of the two families or three families of grasshoppers that are migratory. And these things will one year, they produce a lot of baby grasshopper eggs, and then suddenly next year, boom, and you've got what's called an eruption. And imagine being a small farmer in East Africa where you basically grow enough food to feed your kids and sells a few crops to send them to school and buy them shoes and things like that. And you see this coming at you, and you know that there is nothing you can do about it. Okay. One of the reasons why people of modest means are much more vulnerable to changes that have to do with climate change than the folks that are more well-to-do and can ship food in, and like you and I. Okay. And so imagine seeing your life being eaten by locusts. And so, the farmers get out there with big nets or big towels, and they swat as many as they can. And, that they can't really be getting very many of them. And it's just a terrible thing for them. I mean, it's a natural process by which these grasshoppers do this, but it's still a tragedy if they eat your crops and you have nothing else. One more way which climate change is hurting people of modest means in the world. Well, the last issue I'm going to talk about, let's see, I better do this quick. As we increase the temperature from 1.5 degrees above what it has been before, we are noticing with warmer temperatures a decrease in biodiversity. And biodiversity is necessary for stability in our natural environments. And we are seeing a massive decline of some kinds of insects and not others. Flies are doing fine. Caddisflies and butterflies are having a big problem. And the butterflies are pollinators, and therefore what hurts the butterflies hurts the plants that they pollinate. Okay, so last slide. Cartoons. I have this love of cartoons. Climate change is caused by two things: human activity and human inaction. Pretty well sums it up. We're doing things, we're just not doing the right thing. And we're failing to do the right thing. I would be glad if we have time to answer some questions.
Thank you, Mitch. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please put it in the chat and I will relay it to Mitch. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. It was certainly enlightening. And there are some things that I wanted to ask you before folks start putting in their questions, Mitch. It has, I've noticed from a lot of these fast food corporations. They're incorporating like that Beyond Meat or Impossible protein products. I think they're getting on the bandwagon, so to speak. You know,
Some of them are pretty good too. I don't know if you've tried them, but
I've only tried the Impossible Burger from Burger King, and actually,
yeah,
I
I've tried that a couple of times and thought I'm not sure I could tell the difference. Yeah.
Well, I saw in my news feed that Taco Bell is actually going to be doing. They're going to have a large vegetarian menu, and a lot of it will be like, you know, that Impossible, you know, sort of meats, Beyond Meat, like carne asada, veggie version and stuff like that. So it's like they're making like half their menu just all vegetarian. Like you either have real meat or the protein plant-based meat. So I thought that
I sometimes go to Bethel Food and catch groceries, just right down the hill from where I live. Caroluzzi's it's called now. And they have an increasing variety of vegetarian meat substitutes. So patties of various things made of beans or whatnot. And occasionally I'll buy some and try them, and they're all pretty tasty, I think.
Well, you know what? I agree with you because I've actually gotten those Morningstar chick patties, and you know, my kids are meat eaters and we're meat eaters, you know, and everything. But as I'm getting older, I'm like, maybe I should try doing a little bit more of the vegetarian sort of stuff. It is really, really good. And tonight I'm gonna probably go home, have some waffles and some, you know, vegetarian chick patties and some syrup, and it's gonna be good for dinner.
You know, I mean, you shouldn't feel daunted in that, and I'm talking to everyone here, including myself. We shouldn't be daunted by the idea that we need to move towards less meat. Start with eating less meat and then gradually decrease the amount of meat you're eating. You know, it's not something you have to go cold turkey on.
Exactly.
And it'll, you know, develop new taste, you know, grow your own, you know, in the backyard, find things that you can grow in your own backyard, even if you only got a little deck or something, you know.
One of the questions from one of our audience, are grasshoppers edible?
As a matter of fact, I was going to mention this. This is the other thing you can do when I don't know if the locusts that come in swarms are, but insects in general, there are many kinds of insects which are actually quite tasty. And I can testify to that. In my wife's country of Uganda, there's a small grasshopper that's maybe this big, called ensenene, which people often, when they're in season, they'll go catch a bunch of them and stir fry them, and they're quite good.
Wow.
Yeah. So now I think these great big ones are going to be a lot of shell and not much meat. And so you would probably need to follow on the advice of other people who eat insects. But you can also buy products made from cricket flour, dried crickets that are ground up, and you can get, you know, chips made from cricket flour or supplemented, you know, and you can, you know, chocolate chip cookies. There's one of my colleagues who's an entomologist who makes chocolate chip cookies out of cricket flour every year. And they're perfectly fine as far as I can tell. Now, if you're allergic to shellfish, then you might apparently some of the allergy carries over to grasshoppers. So
gotcha.
So be careful about that.
Then thank you, because I am allergic to shellfish.
Yeah. So I mean, there may be some kinds of insects that you're not being allergic to, so you can check it out.
Great. Any other questions before we can call it a night if we want? If there's any other questions, please feel free to do so. Put it in the chat. If not, I just wanted to let you know that the next meetup will be we're giving October a skip, and we're gonna have the next time will be, I think it's November 28th. Let me just check on that. That will be the next workshop that we're going to have. Yes, that is the November 28th. It is the 6th extinction. That is the title of Mitch's talk, and I will put the link in the chat right now.
So
Oh,
the theme will be how climate change speeds up the rate at which organisms go extinct. And that's actually one I haven't given before, so it'll be new, kind of a new packaging for me. But that's good.
we have another question. Can you explain why gluten allergies are exploding when we have been eating it for a long time?
Well, that is outside of my field of expertise. You would need to talk to an immunologist about that, and such people exist. And we used to have one in my department, but she retired. But if you talk to a nutrition doctor, a doctor who has studied such things, you can probably get the answer to that question.
Great. Well, it is 6:33 tonight, and I just want to thank you all for joining us this evening, and be sure to sign up for November 28th for the 6th extinction. And until next time, have a good evening.
Okay, well, see you next time.
Bye.